The following episode is about an unrepentantly violent neo-Nazi ideologue, his beliefs, and influence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. And hey, everybody, welcome to the show. I have on with me today Spencer Sunshine. Spencer is the author of the newly published book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism. He holds a PhD in sociology and has written extensively on the US far right. He is the co-editor with Pam Chamberlain, Matthew N. Lyons, and Abby Scher of the Chip Burtlet Festschrift, Exposing the Far Right and Fighting for Democracy, out by Routledge. Spencer has also written for the Southern Poverty Law Center, The Daily Beast, The Forward, and Truth Out, and has been translated into numerous languages. Welcome to the show, Spencer.
Thank you for having me on the show, Ryan.
I think the best place to start is with the central figure of your new book. So, to get right into it, who is James Mason? And why is he one of the most important neo Nazis that most people have probably never heard of?
Well, he is, as you sort of mentioned, the most important, certainly living neo-Nazi terrorist ideologue around today with international influence. He wrote a book called Siege, actually a abridged anthology of some newsletters he had written in the 80s. And it is a book that has one of those unusual positions of being a singular text that animates a whole political strain. And so the strain that it is driving forward is the most violent wing of the neo-Nazi and to some other extent white supremacist movement of people who are encouraging their followers to commit massacres, to commit bombings, to commit any kind of high-profile violent act. The most well-known group that was inspired by his works was the Atomwaffen Division in the United States. They've been linked to 5 murders. Everybody in the group was required to read Siege. But now with the disbanding of that group, there's a number of splinters of it. There are all kinds of new groups, and now things have migrated into Telegram, and the channels that are following this perspective are dubbed Terrogram.
What are the core elements of James Mason's ideology, and how does that make him different from both what came before and after him with movements like the alt-right?
So he came up with a rather unusual political perspective that was completely marginal, even amongst neo-Nazis during his time. So originally, Siege was a newsletter published between 1980 and 1986. And he was reflecting on his experiences from the 70s. He had been in the American Nazi Party. Basically, it's under a new name. It kind of cracked up in the 70s. The party did remain, but there were about 10 new groups of it. And they all kind of argued with each other and tried to work with each other. And they all tried to figure out what political direction to go in. He went through this period and was very disenchanted at everything. And he decided there was no point in engaging in any kind of traditional legal political activity. And eventually, even things like guerrilla warfare, he was against. He thought you couldn't build a white supremacist movement through having rallies, through running, forming organizations, through running for office. And so he concluded that he or neo-Nazis needed to destroy the system, borrowed a bunch of 60s New Left jargon. And they would do that by just causing enough chaos and using violence to help destabilize both the liberal state and society as a whole. And then after there was a apocalyptic collapse, perhaps neo-Nazis then would have a chance to seize power. In a weird sense, I agree with him. He decided that there was the society as a large was not going to allow a neo-Nazi, an open neo-Nazi group to take power. And he's right in that. But his answer became, it eventually became something like a murder cult. He was praising serial killers, people committing just big public massacres, mass civil unrest, and there almost became a fetish for it. Um, Fast forward many years later, as I said, he was totally marginalized. He was rediscovered in 2015 by younger neo Nazis. They were sort of parallel with the alt-right. They saw themselves as not part of it, but like if you look historically, they're clearly like part of this movement, this new wave of young far-right activists. They rediscovered him. A lot of things he said seemed to fit, were very prescient. In particular, one of the things he said was like, you should don't throw your life away if you're going to commit a violent act. You should do it in a very dramatic, stylized, high profile way. And this really matched a bunch of massacres that had been going on, in particular, like Tarrant in New Zealand, where he kills 51 Muslims. He live streams it. Breivik a little earlier in Norway, where he kills like 69 people. And so as we saw these things, it seemed like he had predicted this stuff and people could go back to his larger argument. Also, after Charlottesville, the popularity, there was a hashtag called Reed Siege, a sword because he said there's no point in trying to do public political rallies in particular. And many people don't realize this. There was a lot of fighting between fascists and anti-fascists at Charlottesville, but that happened before the rally was supposed to start. And indeed, the rally never even started. The police at that point declared it a riot and pushed everyone away. So they didn't even have a rally. And so it seemed to vindicate his perspective. And people were like, well, if we can't do this, we might as well go all the way and become terrorists. He also was more radical than even advocates of like guerrilla warfare. Like his William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, had been his mentor. He credited him with saving his life when he was a teenager. But Pierce still wanted like a structured white supremacist movement, and the armed guerrilla groups were like going to be part of that movement. Where Mason was like, "Fuck all that! Like, the movement doesn't matter. We just need to create as much chaos through using violence, through using particularly single actor violence." He was an advocate of lone wolf actions back to the 70s, probably the first neo-Nazi who did that in order to have this political outcome. So he became more radical than everybody.
Could you explain more what you mean by lone wolf actions and if there's other spaces that have been influenced by this ideology?
Sure, the idea of the lone wolf, and a lot of us, I use it. He used that term, dislike it. I prefer, and some other single actor actions. The original idea is that somebody will adopt white supremacist ideas and then don't go to meetings, don't join parties, don't be on subscription lists, and then act out violent actions by themselves, and there would be no way to find them. And there's a famous Louis Beam essay. He was a Klan member, published in 1983, called Leaderless Resistance, advocating this in groups, but also saying individuals could do it. But this has become the norm now, where we have single actors, at least, going out and committing most of these massacres, right? It's not groups. In the 80s, there was a underground terrorist group, white supremacist group called The Order, and they had members. They were like, a group of people. And so even that was too structured for compared to what goes on today. Now, a lot of people, the idea of the lone wolf is difficult with the digital transition because, like, are you really a lone wolf if you're like on a Telegram channel or something? You have like some level of visibility, and could there ever be a lone wolf? Because they'd have to meet the movement in order to take the ideas on. So they're somehow already in contact with it or were in contact at one point. So that term's a little sketchy. A lot of people don't use it now, but it is true that most attacks these days are done by single people. Occasionally you get like two of them working together, but that's it.
How does Mason use the occult in his works and his writings?
So if we can talk about religion in a bit of a larger way, it's all over Mason and the people directly around him. So Mason, I'll talk about how Siege, the book, came together so I can introduce these characters and their associations with the stuff, because then they're all over the place. Um, Mason is discovered in 1986 by Boyd Rice, this famous industrial musician who's long been dogged by accusations of neo-Nazism, which are 100% true. And in fact, they're much worse than anyone knew. And I made a video showing all the evidence I I got. It's on YouTube. It's called Boyd Rice, Neo-Nazi Collaborator. He came into contact with Mason and he introduced him essentially to three other people. One is Adam Parfrey, a very famous publisher who ran Feral House Press. Nicholas Schreck, he meets a bit on the side, who's a Satanist, and Michael Moynihan, who's an industrial musician who then started playing neo-folk. And so the four are important. Mason is an atheist at first, although he starts to adopt crypto-spiritual ideas slowly before, and I'll get to it, establishing his own idiosyncratic racist version of Christianity. So, and they're all in contact with Charles Manson. It's a really wild story. So Mason's in contact with Charles Manson and declares him to be the new neo-Nazi guru. And basically, these guys are all obsessed with Charles Manson too. And like Hitler or Nazis, and they're so like Rice was obsessed with Hitler and Manson, and then basically he meets him, another white supremacist. I think he meets fairly randomly at a gun show. Is like, hey, there is a neo-Nazi who's friends with Charles Manson. I'm sure Rice was like, oh my God, this is like fucking Christmas. So Manson is a Gnostic, was a Gnostic. He died. Him and a number of other people died while I was writing the book, and has these spiritual beliefs, and that in some sense rubbed off on the others. Boyd Rice, in particular, adopted a lot of Gnostic beliefs. And there's a whole debate over, is there a tradition of Gnosticism, blah, blah, blah. But this is their own self-identification, so we can leave it at that. I believe a lot of Parfrey stuff was Gnostic in essence, in the sense that he thought a lot of extremes, if there just was if we could somehow use or encompass or be familiar with all kinds of extremes, we could break through this sort of consensus reality to an underlying truth. Manson had a version of that. And these guys got really into not just Manson, but Alfred Rosenberg, who was a Gnostic, who was an important German Nazi party propagandist who created this like racist, Aryan, like mythologically based version of Gnosticism. So there's Gnostics in here. Heathens, of course, are here mostly through a little bit through Rice, who saw like Hitler as a kind of archetype, which was this dialogue in the 70s that was fairly popular, but mostly through Michael Moynihan. And Moynihan was younger than the others, but he was super important because he was the one who took Mason's newsletters and edited them into a book and then published the book himself. And he was originally, although he denies this, a kind of Nazi Satanist. I should say he was a Charles Manson, James Mason version of Nazism. He also joined the Church of Satan, but I'll get to this in a minute. But around the time he's done with the book, he moves more towards embracing the racist heathenism and and ethnocentric heathenism. And he is like this when he writes a famous book later on called Lords of Chaos that comes out in 98. It's also published, like many of these books, by Adam Parfrey. And you can even see in the book, if you read it closely, he talks about Varg Vikernes of Burzum, the Nazi black metal musician, seen as the founder of NSBM, National Socialist Black Metal, that Varg moves from a Nazi Satanism to a ethno-separatist heathenism. And this is actually the move that at the exact same time Moynihan is doing. Moynihan also comes into contact with and starts working closely with Robert N. Taylor. Taylor is a real old school heathen. He got into stuff in the 60s and 70s. He's close to Stephen McNallen. He's gone through all these groups. He's still around. He's still a practicing heathen. And he goes through this whole spectrum of groups. You have to forgive me. I can't remember if he's in the earlier AFA or not, but like there's AFA and there's little groups splitting off and then they restructure it and stuff. I have a chapter in the book. A chapter's about Taylor, and McNallen comes in here. McNallen's interesting. I didn't realize that he was an early proponent in the United States of ethnocentrism. I usually think of the European New Right who are advocating this, like Alain de Benoist, who influenced Moynihan, but also Moynihan was around McNallen. And so there's this dual influence. And I think McNallen's one of the first people in the United States, racist people, to advocate this position. I think this needs to be unpacked a lot more. I think far-right scholars know about him, but he doesn't get the attention he deserves. He was at Charlottesville, for example. He had broken off of AFA to form a more explicitly racist group called the Wotan or Votan Network. So I think more eyes need to be on him and his influence. So these are the heathens. There are these four guys. They're in a paper organization called the Abraxas Foundation, the so-called occult fascist think tank, although it's mostly a name for them. Boyd Rice does put one newspaper out a little later on called Awake. They're all in or around the Church of Satan. Moynihan and Rice are both priests in the church, as well as a third guy that I mentioned a little bit. There's a little short chapter on him, Thomas Thorne, who was in the famous industrial dance band, whatever you want to call him, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, and then later formed his own band, the Electric Hellfire Club. And I remember this very clearly because I saw Rice and Electric Hellfire Club play in the mid 90s, and I was like, what a weird bill. But now I'm like, oh, they were both living in Denver, and they're both into Nazi and Satanist stuff. So Thorne is a priest too. Thorne is thanked in Siege. Um, as well as Parfrey, as well as Peter Gilmore, the current head of the Church of Satan. So these two guys are priests, and Thorne. Adam Parfrey becomes Anton LaVey's publisher, and Nicholas Schreck is a Satanist, and he marries LaVey's daughter, Zena. And together, she's the spokesperson for the church during the Satanic Panic in the 80s, and they sort of go on shows together. So they're all around the Church of Satan. Church of Satan has long had true accusations of neo-Nazi involvement. LaVey decided, if you look at Aquino's history of the Church of Satan, he talks about discussions he had with LaVey in association with a very early American neo-Nazi group, early post-war group called the National Renaissance Party. And LaVey told me, he's like, oh, yeah, I know the leader of it, James Madole. Like, he gave me a membership card. Nazis are welcome in the church. And so Aquino was like, okay. And then this sort of built, and in the 80s, there was a big debate inside the church and through the 90s about whether Satanism was compatible with National Socialism. And a lot of people thought yes. And not just, there was a lot of the stuff was run in the official church publication, The Black Flame, that Gilmore was editing. And I found through my research, Gilmore didn't just preside over this conversation, but at one point actively, that I know of, I'm sure many more occasions, actively submitted or not submitted, but actively asked if a paper or an article advocating this combination from Michael Moynihan could be run in the paper. So he didn't just oversee a discussion. He actively solicited, arguments for Nazi Satanism is what it's usually called. So Satanism plays a role in here, although Mason never was a Satanist. So and then we'll come to him. And these are all atheistic Satanists. None of them are theists. Although Shrekins, later joined the Temple of Set, and I do believe, it's my understanding, I could be wrong, become theistic Satanist. And there's a long discussion about whether Temple of Set, their involvement with National Socialism, because they were supposed to be the non-racist version of the Church of Satan. And in fact, I did find that a lot of Nazi Satanists were in the church. Kerry Bolton, for example, and Eldred Flowers, who's also influential on the heathen scene. They were both in it. And so Moynihan spirituality does pervade his ideas. I think by the late 70s, he says, I'm an atheist, and through the 80s, but in the late 70s, he starts to say these sort of psychological, spiritual things like National Socialism isn't just about forming a party. It's going to be a total personal mental transformation into something else. And I think, people familiar, especially with New Age kind of psychological, spiritual stuff, can see like you can't have a total transformation of your personality. That is the spiritual idea. It's not possible, but this is a spiritual idea. In the 80s, he's wrangling with these issues. You can see him go back and forth on Christianity, but he forms this philosophy called universal order that basically is a combination of National Socialism and Charles Manson's ideas. But Manson's a very spiritual person, and so Mason's not recognizing it, but there becomes this Gnostic element creeping into his thought, that there's some reality underneath. It's very, there's a reality, a true reality, like Manson calls it, the truth with a capital T, or reality with a capital R, underneath this like Jewish controlled illusion that structures the society. And then in 94, he has a spiritual experience, and he goes to prison for threatening his ex-girlfriend. And there he develops his own idiosyncratic brand of Christianity that involves racism, anti-Semitism, and UFOs. He's influenced by the book, what is it, Danikin's, is it a Chariots of the Gods, or
I think so. It
yeah,
always comes back to UFOs somehow.
Yeah, yeah, it comes back to you. So he gets into UFOs, and the Bible is really describing UFOs, and then when he gets out of prison, he wrote a bunch of books about outlining this in prison. He publishes them, and he kind of sours on Satanism at that point. He really distances himself from Satanism. Earlier on, there's pictures of him like in a cleric's robe, a Satanist priest's robe with Moynihan and others. But this is like he's out on the town, and he's surrounded by Satanists. A number of Satanists are thanked in Siege. Um, but later, as he becomes Christian, of course, he has to separate himself from it. Although he does keep his respect for Anton LaVey as sort of a fellow, almost charlatan. He like Mason's idol George Lincoln Rockwell, who formed the Nazi Party. He saw them as doing similar things with publicity. And what he did with Charles Manson is that these guys, like Rockwell, put a swastika out in front of his group to get media attention, and LaVey put a Satanist imagery and pentagrams out to get media attention. And Mason used Charles Manson to get media attention. After they sort of reeled in people who were just interested in the extremes, then they indoctrinated them into their political movement. So he kept a appreciation for LaVey, of course, who was an atheist anyway, even though he was Jewish. Mason would use Jews for his own ends, the ones who are willing to work with him, which is a stranger thing, but separated himself from Satanism. So there are these spiritual traditions all around this whole story.
What do you think drove particularly Mason's shifts from like moving from like a more kind of atheistic view into like say LaVey's Satanism and into Christianity and also like more broadly like with folks like say Moynihan doing a similar shift to like neo-Volkish Asatru and other similar stuff. Does it feel like there's an element of opportunism or like something deeper there or
Well, let's talk about them separately because they're definitely separate trajectories. Like I said, I think Mason is starting to dabble with spiritual ideas in the 70s, even while he thinks of himself as complete atheist. He's like this notion of like a total transformation of the self. In the 80s, when he's influenced by Charles Manson. I think again, he doesn't realize these are essentially spiritual ideas underneath, and he still thinks of himself as an atheist. So there's a building spirituality that he doesn't recognize. And then I think he has this big spiritual experience that he thinks is like walking into a timelessness, you know, which again seems kind of Gnostic. And then I don't know quite why he adopts Christianity. Maybe it's just there. He does do this interesting book. I think he assembles it in prison and publishes it right after, called The Theocrat, and it's passages from Mein Kampf next to passages from the Bible that are quite similar. Yeah, so it's actually quite a clever thing. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. And so I don't know what the turn towards Christianity is. I based a lot of this book on letters to people, and I didn't find this. Definitely the turn creates a lot of tension with people. He's very tight with Tom Metzger, who is an atheist, who had been a Christian identity minister, and really soured on that stuff. And Metzger doesn't like all the Christian writings. And he tries to exchange some letters with Katja Lane, who's an Odinist, who's a very, very smart person, is a polyglot. At that time, one of the smartest people in that movement, along with Wayne Pierce. Her husband was the imprisoned, the order member, David Lane. And they can't work together because he's writing Christian stuff at this point, and she's like not having any of it. So I'm not quite clear what promotes the turn. I get a Bible in prison. Sometimes people just use what they have, right? That what is around them. And he had already been this spiritual experience right before he goes to prison, had already primed him to explore this further. Moynihan's the other one. Um, I think Moynihan's early Nazi Satanism was just a dabbling in extremes. In a sense, not the Nazism. He's a racist. But and he was never really a Satanist. He was in the church, but he liked LaVey. LaVey was a very charismatic guy that a lot of people are like, I didn't like the Satanist stuff, but then I met LaVey, and LaVey's amazing, so I joined the church. Like there are a lot of people who met him once, and he made priests too. He was also not quite using people, but he was very adroit about culture. So like he made Marilyn Manson a priest. He did this very intentionally to promote the church, and he cultivated musicians. He himself was a musician. Hated rock, but he was like an organist. So you have this understanding of the power of music. Um, I don't know. Again, I know that Moynihan started becoming interested in like, you know, it's is it a Satru? It's unclear early on. Some of these bands, these metal bands, he starts writing about them as early as he's still working on Siege, which comes out in early '93. And I don't know, this is just like his interest in this direction develops. He's very interested in medieval German. He does both a master's and PhD in Germanic studies, studying, I think, linguistic parts of medieval German. I mean, for a guy with so many like kind of outlandish ideas, he seems to be a serious scholar, at least about this. And so I think this clearly matches with his intellectual studies, but not quite sure what promotes him this way. I'm starts playing neo folk. It seems like to me like all sort of one thing, you know. Dude's playing neo folk, dude's like doing Germanic studies. He has more of, I think, an innately spiritual sense than Mason did. And so I think he starts Lords of Chaos directly after Siege. It's people don't quite realize this. It's his absolute next project he jumps into. And it just sort of all goes together. But again, since I based this on the letters, I can't really. I never asked him. He wouldn't respond to my requests for interview, which I was kind of happy about because he's a liar, and I didn't want to like be like, well, this is the truth, and then Moynihan says this lie, so I need to print it. People use this commentary for media with this, so I'm not quite sure what inspired that, but he was part of a movement of people who did make this transition, I think.
What role, just sort of zooming out a little bit, do you think this kind of countercultural sort of underground Nazism played in the development of the far right in the US and allowing like these ideas to come through to now we have Tucker Carlson up until he was fired from Fox News and since then like openly talking great replacement and stuff, which used to be like well in the fringes in places like the Camp of Saints and Turner Diaries and stuff like that. What do you think there's like connective tissue here that runs through these countercultural elements?
You mean starting in the teens or?
Yeah, like starting in like like from the folks that are like doing the stuff in the 80s and 90s and then coming back up into the teens when you start seeing like Richard Spencer and these other guys pop up.
Well, the people around Mason, these four guys in the Abraxas Foundation, Moynihan, Rice, Schreck, and Parfrey, are influential in the alt-right stuff. You can see it, and I document in the book all of the ways that they lied about because they all lied about what happened afterwards. They didn't want to fuck their careers up, or like, oh, it's just a joke, or they admit the whole thing, or whatever. And they go through a series of lies. They do interesting stuff that you see now where they act like a Nazi in public and then say it's a joke, but they're really Nazis or they're really involved in neo-Nazism. It's a little unclear what their actual investment is. Or they definitely portray themselves to Mason as neo-Nazis and they're clearly interested in it. And this just sort of using like it's a joke. I think there's certain strategies like that, and they were connected to a next generation of people like Jim Goad. They collected a big circle around them. I have a little concentric circle graphic at the beginning showing this. They collected certain people who became influential in the New Right more directly, like Jim Goad, who Gavin McGinnis, the founder of the Proud Boys, absolutely said was like his idol. Goad was involved in some early stuff. He's a writer, I believe, for Countercurrents now. He's an open white supremacist now, even though he kind of always was. So there's some development there. In terms of more recent stuff, I think the best way to think about this stuff is less as influence on the mainstream far right and more like it's one ecosystem and they're on one side of it. And all elements in this ecosystem are interacting with it. Like, anarchists and communists today have a relationship with liberal Democrats. Like, issues flow through all of them that are similar. And there's a back and forth, and ideas, they influence each other as members go from one to the other. And they're trying to pull, especially more radical people, are trying to pull people from the mainstream into their camp. Mason likes Camp of Saints. He actually mentions it early on. And yeah, it's true that this stuff floated into the mainstream far right. I think more through groups like VDARE, who were very influential in the Trump administration last time, who, hooray, have disbanded under legal pressure from the government. Of course, like almost all white supremacist stuff. They did a lot of financial chicanery. Like, some parts of the far right, like Sovereign Citizens, it's unclear where politics stops and like, just a scam starts, like a financial scam. This is not uncommon in that stuff. David Duke is often, I think he went to jail for defrauding his followers. Um, so I think it's more like it's the most radical part of the far right, and we should see in the United States, it's different elsewhere, sometimes different elsewhere. National socialists, terrorist white supremacists is merely one side of one thing. So that's what I would say. And then there's just natural cross pollination.
One thing I want to particularly zoom in on for a sec is that element of the grift, because that was something that struck me in reading through your book, was just sort of looking at like the particular mechanics of the disputes going on within the neo-Nazi movement in the 70s and like references to things like key properties being owned by specific individuals within the party as opposed to like being
Mm-hmm.
owned corporately or something. And that's also something that's been like observed with like Operation Werewolf and other similar groups now, which like from a business standpoint is questionable
Mm-hmm.
because if something happens, then you personally are going to be liable as opposed to I mean, that's why limited liability corporations exist. Like, what's the upside to having that kind of risk?
Well, Mason turned away from all of this, and he says there's no copyright on Siege. Like, don't give me, I'm against dues. Like, and he's actually stands out by being one of the few people who's like, I'm a neo-Nazi. Like, I am proud of this. Here's my swastika. He insisted groups use the swastika openly. He's like, don't give me money. He wanted money for his subscriptions, and that's it. At the end of the day, he's like, I think I broke even at the end of the day, and that's all I care about, to continue buying materials to print stuff. The group, the NSWPP, that had been the American Nazi Party, this is what you're referring to. They had a strategy of the local groups forming, they called them bookstores, but they were sort of just storefronts with some propaganda. Occasionally, they sold a book or two you could walk into. They were just like maybe a clubhouse or something. Some of them used them more as organizing spaces. And like I said, about 10 groups splintered off of this party in the 70s. Partly they hated the leader, but the leader was also making everyone sell the headquarters and then taking all the money himself and trying to centralize power around himself. So a lot of the groups were like, fuck you, we're not like most of the groups bought the headquarters with their own money. And so they were like ixnay and formed their own group. And the party eventually got into trouble in 1978 about financial trouble with the government. I believe this is even something so obscure, even I don't know about it, but this really handicapped. This was sort of the end of it being a vibrant organization with hundreds, if not 1,000. I think they claim at one point 1,000, but clearly with hundreds of members. So finances come back against them. Mason says don't form businesses, don't form, he specifically says corporations, don't form them as part of his lone wolf strategy. Um, the others, I don't know, like the Abraxas Foundation doesn't have any legal standing. The others are musicians and cultural workers. Obviously, Parfrey's Press has, is what became a very big deal. Sold millions of copies of all of the books together, I'm sure. Um, or got to be something close. I don't know. Some of the books sold upwards of 100,000 copies. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question or not about finances. I was like, oh yeah, you're a economist. I forgot about that.
And it's kind of interesting seeing how we go back to the 70s with like out and out neo-Nazis falling out with the organization over financial malfeasance, and we jump now to like it seems like a lot of the far right's infrastructure and biggest leaders are all running some kind of scam.
They do.
Like Alex Jones, it's probably safe to say is one giant pyramid scheme at this point.
Oh, he for sure is. I forgot there's one thing. The National Socialist Movement is co-founded by James Mason, the one that's existed for years and years and years. He doesn't usually talk about this because it kind of turned into the political opposite of what he wanted. He gets in a fight. He basically tries to hijack the organization and fuses his faction with another org, but he claims he's in charge of it. But the guy who is actually in charge of it is like, fuck you. And so they actually get in a copyright battle and in a battle with the post office over the name. And Mason argues his letters to officials in the post office that he's the rightful owner of the name, and so the other guy's committing mail fraud by having the mail to the NSM delivered to the other guy. And this goes on and on. It's really funny, and the postal authorities are like, "What the fuck ever?" The police get involved. Oh, and then the other leader starts filling out subscriptions in Mason's name for magazines, and Mason complains to the authorities, and you're like, "Wow, this is petty for neo-Nazis promoting terrorism." But there was a great quote in there. It's almost the best quote in the book. Some police officer, Mason, somehow got hold of this letter, basically sums this up by saying, well, Mason and this other guy basically used to be friends, and somewhere along the way they fell out. And I was like, yeah, that's probably the best summary of these years of fighting, between the two. So yeah, there's stuff like that. There often is like weird, there's a desire, at least in the past, I think it's certainly changed, for some kind of legitimacy that the far right has, to have a company, to have titles. You always see these guys claiming they're doctors or something. Dr. David Duke, he has an honorary degree from some anti-Semitic university. I mean, William Pierce actually did, but like Dr. Anton LaVey is not a doctor. So there's always an attempt to create some veneer of legality, even if it's totally bogus, or having some
Okay.
legal standing, I should say.
One thing that I especially appreciated about this book is the incredible level of detail that you bring on like the ins and outs of these movements, especially because there's not very much that's been done about these folks. Like the one other book I can think of that gets close to your level of details, like Kathleen Bellew's Bring the War Home. Um, that's really covering this period, which, like as you demonstrate, I think is critical because this is a very formative period for understanding the far right as it is now. Um, and one thing that I know that Ballou observed in her book was it was often really difficult to get at things like archival materials and such because they're often either not organized or accessible for obvious reasons of things like Nazis not wanting to share what they've got.
Mhm.
How did you manage to effectively address this, especially based on that you've been a longtime anti-fascist researcher?
It was very easy for me because of the James Mason papers held at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. Now, I found out it's not easy to get to Lawrence, Kansas. If you don't have a car or don't have enough money to rent a car and keep it around for a week, you have to fly into an airport like an hour away. I think I eventually got an Uber. I just paid an Uber driver to drive me to Lawrence. It was like cheaper than renting a car and keeping it or taking a bus in the middle of the night. And what was there I found was 60 boxes of correspondence from James Mason. And he was an insider, a real insider into the neo-Nazi movement. He had been in the original American Nazi Party, giving him impeccable pedigree. And he was a young kid, so he outlived a lot of these guys. Was an insider, and he corresponded. It was from the paper days. I think the archive stops in 2003. Corresponded with almost everybody at some time or another. And he kept not just every letter, but carbon copies of his outgoing letters. So when I found this, I was like, wow, there is no other archive that has this kind of slice of American socialist life just on its own. I knew what it was because I've been doing this work a long time. And I knew the importance of these letters to the countercultural scene, to Rice and to Parfrey in particular. I think if I'd just been a far right researcher, I'd be like, oh, yeah, yeah. And these guys put the book out. But because I was familiar with these arguments about them that had gone on for decades and decades, and there was such amazingly incriminating material, and it revealed so much stuff that people didn't know. Like I spent a long time the second half of the book about this, just because I knew what it was, whereas I think other people wouldn't. Or if you were interested in the counterculture part, you might not be interested in all the ins and outs, the sectarian ins and outs of the neo-Nazi movement of the 70s. But I was always a leftist a sectologist. I can pretty much tell you the entire history of Trotskyism in the 20th century United States, although I will spare your listeners. You should read Max Shachtman, though, a fascinating guy, anti-communist Marxist. Um, and so I knew it was there. And in a sense, when I was writing the book, I felt like I'd fallen into James Mason's trap. Like archives attract researchers and produce books because you have the material. If there's no material on someone, it's hard to write a book about them. You know what I mean? And I know he sold this material because he had had a fascinating life and he knew all these people. There's Satanists and there's terrorists. He's got all these letters to imprisoned, murderers. There's all these undocumented parts of American National Socialism. So I could do it. As I say in the introduction, I think people should read it. You can read the book in different ways, like as a reference book or however you want to. But I was like, you should read it as a soap opera. Like these people have these really wild lives, and it's really like a series of profiles with the common thread being they interact with Mason. And so I write profiles of all these groups and people is how the book is kind of structured. It was very difficult to figure out how to structure. Um, and so yeah, and then I supplemented it. He had all these magazines. He had collected these tiny little neo-Nazi magazines that were whole runs of them that were unavailable anywhere. Even if you found an archive of far right stuff, they might have one or two issues. And for many, many decades, really until recently, archives didn't collect far right stuff by and large. They thought, oh, these are just a bunch of fringe kooks. And so it's very, very difficult to get hold of these materials. I did supplement it with some other archives, like the Center for Democratic Renewals in Atlanta, Georgia, and did some stuff. There's one in Rhode Island. I mean, like there was an issue of War, the White Aryan Resistance newspaper that Metzger put out that I really needed. It has a Adam Parfrey contribution in it. And it was so difficult to get. I eventually, and only after a lot of wrangling, paid an archive in New York City, where I was, $40 just to scan this issue. It was like that difficult to get hold of it. I didn't really have another. Otherwise, I had to fly somewhere in the country to go do this. It was very, very difficult. And the finding aids didn't necessarily say what issues they had. So yeah, I could do it because of this archive. And I also found out, it's very interesting, none of the counterculture people would talk to me. None of the four main guys would talk to me. People who knew Boyd Rice in the 80s in San Francisco from the punk scene, none of them would talk to me, who had fallings out with him or maybe didn't. It was a little unclear sometimes. Like Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys, I tried to talk to him and he wouldn't. And I said, "Can I do a fact check to someone at his record label?" And they're like, "Yeah." So I sent him the fact check, and he sends it back, and he's like, I'm not going to do this." It was a very nice letter. He said, "I'm not going to do this, and actually, can you take my name out of the book?" So, well, who did talk to me were the old Nazis. Mason answered 50 questions of mine. The guy who's the head of what was the American Nazi Party, him and I had quite a long exchange. It's ongoing. Some other characters also. One guy was in jail, the second head of the National Socialist Liberation Front. This group Mason was in. We exchanged again maybe a dozen letters. Fascinating character in jail for pedophilia. Um, Amazing memory. Like he drew the cover of a magazine he put out in the 1970s from memory by hand. It was truly amazing how detailed his memory was. I also realized when people say a lot of child molesters are charismatic, I was like, oh, okay, I get it now, through my interaction with him. So those guys would talk to me. Some of them were very, I think, Mason, very interested in having their lineage documented and defending it. They all squabbled with each other. So at some point between Kerr and Mason and Russ, the imprisoned pedophile, I was like the interlocutor for them rehashing their arguments from the 70s. Like they ignored that I was this like Jewish anti-fascist or whatever, right? And they're just like, he said this. No, it didn't go down like that. And you're like, this is a crazy position to be in. But yeah, they were all very nice. I think the only guy who didn't reply to me was uh, Hoffman. I forget his first name. The second, who's a Holocaust denier, and he was like, "I know who you are. I'm not going to talk to you." So he was the only one of the neo Nazis who refused. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then the older ones had this strategy of publicity. Like they were trying to get publicity, and so they would talk to anyone to use them. I didn't get to Metzger before he died. I think he died in 2020. I was going to interview him at the end and I didn't. So yeah, so I was able to come up. In fact, it was too much material for me. There were more folders of letters to James Mason in his archive that I didn't get to. And I spent 5 years working on this book and the last 3 years full time. And I got overwhelmed. I got overwhelmed with the amount of material that was there, especially because I cover a lot of people. It's really two separate books, the counterculture people and the Nazis. So yeah, I ran into the opposite problem, but only because Mason had saved all of his papers and deposited them. But yeah, a lot of people don't have papers, didn't collect them. It was illegal stuff. They destroyed them or the Fed seized them. Um, this is a funny anarchist history thing. We don't know, for example, much about Emma Goldman's last speaking tour in the US about Friedrich Nietzsche, because when she was deported, when she was arrested and then deported, the Fed seized all her papers and they're like in a crate somewhere in the back of an FBI warehouse. True story.
To turn to a little bit of a thought experiment, and this is something that I hope will give a sense of Mason's influence on the broader far right. How do you think the movement would have been impacted if Mason had never become the man that he was? Which is something that, like, from reading your book, like there's lots of examples of like lethal violence in like the early and mid 70s neo-Nazi scene, of not just of actually it seemed more primarily between each other than necessarily by people opposed to them. Um, and I could absolutely see like a scenario where he makes a wrong turn or something happens and we don't have a James Mason. How do you think that would have influenced the development of this movement?
Well, there were a lot of single actor killings. I found out through this book, it's actually quite interesting. If we look at neo-Nazis and not white supremacists, that the first in the United States post-war neo-Nazi mass murders in only in 1977. Um, and Mason starts to see these murders start to ramp up. He embraces them, and that's part of why he constructs his ideas on the basis of them. Other neo-Nazis are like, wow, these kooks are delegitimizing our movement. And he was like, no, no, we can use them. This is good. They're trying to destabilize the system. Yeah, there was increasing violence in the 80s, starting with the Greensboro massacre in 79, and then the Order, and then running into Nazi skinheads. Somehow this ran parallel to Mason. He's clearly absorbing this, but his own ideas aren't being picked up. Um, I think, and I think like a lot of, I'm do a bunch of weird mixture of different things, but like intellectual history, is certain part of it. Like I want Mason is a key text that people keep coming back to now. Would there be a bunch of single actor massacres? There must have been. Like everything's been moving in that direction. Would they look the way they are now? Would this current network of people exist the way it does? No, because once you start doing this and people are like, hey, there's a book about it, the people who read stuff go back and read that book, and then maybe it expands how they think about stuff or changes how they think about stuff or like sharpens how they think about stuff. We know there's at least, I have figured out, and there are probably more, a dozen murders that can be linked directly to Mason's ideas. They were Atomwaffen members, they had to read Siege, or they mentioned Siege, or the Terrorism, sort of network, which is directly inspired by Siege in their manifestos and stuff. So like there's a clear link there. Would things look similar? Probably somewhat similar. Um, is he recognized as an influence on this stuff? Did he sort of make what's going on in his own image? Yeah, probably.
One thing that I think also leaps out both in this conversation and also in a lot more detail in your book is the degree to which there's a lot of infighting within the far right. Um, and I think that there's just sort of this general conception in society, as well as like on the left, of that the left is uniquely prone to infighting and the right is somehow this like big lockstep machine that everything just sort of works together. What is it that seems to drive this kind of infighting within the far right and sort of adjacent sectors?
Well, the far right is, and white supremacists in particular, are notorious for infighting. Certainly the left is. God, you look back at the 70s again. A lot of what's happening is an interesting parallel with the left in the 70s as the SDS, the big radical student group, hundreds of thousands of members, breaks up. It splits into this whole constellation of tiny Marxist-Leninist groups who then proceed to really squabble and split and do things. And the Nazi groups I document in the book, the neo-Nazi ones in the 70s, are really doing the same thing. I think on the far right, a lot of this stuff is driven by several things. One, uh, they have a real fixation on leadership and cults of the leaders. And this, because then each leader feuds with each other. And this is something you don't find so much on the left. It's more about the organization and less about the leader. They're financial grifts. This is part of what causes tension there, certainly with David Duke and people who broke off of him, like Tom Metzger and Carl Hand, who led the NSLF, the National Socialist Liberation Front. They are very specific about financial stuff. Just like the far right is really an emotionally driven thing. It's driven by outrage. It's driven by a sense of aggrievement. And I think that really creates a much more volatile situation for arguments. There's a lot of murders between white supremacists, an incredible amount. When people, they'll often, I know people don't like the Anti-Defamation League for, good reasons, but the research on the far right is quite good. And they're the ones, there's a division of labor about certain things. They're the ones who come up with a count every year of how many people have been killed by white supremacists. If you break it down, quite a number of them are white supremacists killing each other. This is so there is a lot of tension inside of that movement over a variety of different things. That and that's a good question worth some more looking, but it's not unique. These sorts of infighting is certainly not unique to that, not unique to religions. How many versions of Christianity are there? I mean, really? I mean, do heathens all get along with each other, or is there some infighting there between that movement over certain issues? You know.
So, to turn to something to give a little bit of a lift before we wrap up, um, what is it that gives you hope in the times that we're facing, where we're seeing an even more resurgent far right and increasingly radicalized right wing in mainstream politics, not just in the US, but also like recently in like state election or other, regional elections in Germany, and where like the Alternative for Deutschland party has picked up a surprising
Mhm.
number of seats in different like eastern regions of the country, and other similar examples of like Christian nationalism, like on the march in many different places. What is it that gives you hope in these times?
Well, I'm first off, I'm not as depressed as other people because I've been watching this stuff for so long that it's not so much of a surprise. Like when Trump was started a campaign, people were really like, "Oh my God, how could this happen here? Let's look at the American situation." But in another sense, the first far-right xenophobic party that achieved a good level of electoral success happened in 1999 in Austria, the Freedom, I think it's like the Freedom Party. And this had been in many, not all, I found out not all, thankfully, like not Norway, many countries, this sort of xenophobic far right parties had been established and were ongoing for a long time. And the idea that American and Western European politics are somehow unconnected or not, general same things going on politically and culturally is absurd. It's like an American provincialism where we don't look at other places. So, I mean, was it surprised the level of it? Yes, but I had seen this stuff for a long time. I'm not surprised that a lot of people, white supremacists were always very frustrated. They were like, "We know so many white people agree with our ideas, they just won't come out and say it." And so now they came out and say it. They've come out and said it. The far right under Trump, at some point Trump will go away. We've been waiting for this for a long time, and we did hope when Biden was elected it would sort of burst the bubble, but it didn't. He's older and he will go away at some point. This movement will fade at some point, hopefully. I mean, that I do hope. There is a question of like, has liberalism, has like let's call it democracy, has democracy reached its limits in which people have looked to it for hope of a better future, that it will continue to change things for the better? It's sort of in the way that like the whole world is now countries, it's all divided up. Has democracy reached its limits and people no longer look to it, and so they're looking now backwards to a cloistering of themselves, a xenophobia of trying to keep what they have, maybe. And we will see the far right, at least, in some countries, continue on, I think, as a major player for a long time. In the US, it's a little more different because the winner take all system and the influence of the president to set the tone of the country. A lot of times people ignore this, like how it's not like their policies is like, do they set the tone of the country? Like Obama was like this. People are like, oh, he's a neoliberal, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, that's fair and all, but you don't understand, other things he's doing. People who look to him and the inspiration or just aspirations of people. But the left is resurgent. I mean, when I got involved in leftist politics in the 90s, and boy, like unions were like at a low point. There weren't so like the social movements of the 60s had collapsed. It was you go to meetings and you go to a demonstration and there were like five people there. Like I had a rule. I wouldn't stay at the demo if there weren't at least five people. You never see that now. The union movement's resurgent. Historically oppressed groups, they're vibrant movements of all of them across the spectrum. I don't always agree with the politics of all of them, but you can't like Native Americans since Standing Rock has had a huge revival. Obviously with Black Lives Matter, these are no longer dead issues. What had happened with black movements focused on black issues, like they had kind of the civil rights activists had sort of petered out, and even that wave of black nationalism that started in jump started in the late 60s had also kind of these old school black nationalists had petered out. So there's like a whole new vibrant generation of stuff. The union movement has revitalized itself. And there's no we've had big street movements one after the other. We had the anti-fascist movement, Black Lives Matter, and now again, no matter how much I disagree with certain stances of it, like Palestine solidarity stuff, right? There are waves of leftist activism. And Harris is like, I mean, I liked Biden. Honestly, I thought he was policy-wise one of the best presidents we've had, probably since Carter. Maybe a contentious argument. And I don't think Harris is going to be as good. I think she'll be worse, but she has really, ignited a passion amongst liberals, and that is good too. The country's divided. It's not the far, it's not, if you look at the population, the Democrats get more of the popular vote. But the country is pretty divided, but like there's no reason. I mean, I don't hang out with Republicans even in the best of times. Like under Obama, I wasn't hanging out with them, and that's me. And I don't want to abandon people in red states or red areas, but like things are not things are moving on the left part of the country. They're vibrant and people are fighting back, even with all the attacks against trans people. The trans politics are like super engaged. Like people are fully 100% engaged who are trans, and people are directly working with that movement. And there's plenty. If you want to be an activist, it's not like in the 90s where we couldn't get any traction and there weren't people even to recruit and it was like a dead dog. Like there's plenty of stuff to do. There are many possibilities open.
So, thank you for coming on today, Spencer. Before we go, is there anything that you'd like to plug?
I would like to do some self-capitalism. I am not employed by universities, by think tanks, despite what certain conspiracy theorists say. I do not work for the FBI, the CIA, Mossad, or Interpol. So I do have a Patreon, which is where is my most steady stream of income. It's Spencer Sunshine. You can sign up for $2 a month. You get exclusive content. You can also just try it out for a week now on Patreon if you want to see the kind of stuff I write there. I'm sure it'll give you a warm, fuzzy feeling to support anti-fascist research. So I'm also on like all the socials, Twitter, I'm most active on, but I'm like on Blue Sky and Facebook and Mastodon and Threads and Instagram, and I have a website and all the good stuff like that. But my book's available from Routledge. They often have 20% sales, and actually, if you contact me, I have a coupon code that I'll tell your listeners right now. If you go buy a book from the Routledge website and you can put in a code NNTCF30 and you'll get 30% off. So do that now. NNTCF30. There we go. There's ending the self-capitalism.
Alrighty. Well, thank you again. And thank you all for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.